Ladies and gentlemen, the 60th anniversary of the 1956 revolution and struggle for liberation gives us an opportunity to consider some questions that bear heavily on both our present and our future. What, for instance, does 1956 mean for us as Hungarians, and what does it mean for the world? What is its true significance, and what were its short as well as long-term consequences? The aim of this lecture is to present some of these consequences and to demonstrate how the social memory of the revolution has changed over the last 6 decades. How did contemporary Hungarian society react to this struggle for liberty in 1956? And what influences have there been since on its role in defining our collective identity? The question of social memory is especially important because 1956 was the province of all of Hungarian society, as is the preservation and fitting remembrance of its memory. The Soviet-style single-party communist dictatorship that was developed in course of a few years after the end of the Second World War meant complete subjection for every social group. There was absolute repression at every level of society. What's more, it was precisely the most dynamic forces in Hungarian society that felt most strangled and most hopeless for the future. And though the regime maintained that it represented the working people, leaning on them as the source of its legitimacy, the poor financial situation and the painful lack of social mobility gave rise to deep frustration within the working class as well. Uncertainty grew general, as well as a sense of impermanence, while many people's identities became entirely confused. These years and years of trampling on national feeling was bound eventually to have consequences. The 1956 revolution and struggle for freedom brought to the fore all the tensions of more than 10 years of freedom denied since the Second World War. The problems inherited from the past became compounded. Those participating in the revolution demanded above all an end to the dictatorship, independence for Hungary, the reinstatement of democratic freedoms, a multi-party political system, and free elections. There was not a single significant social group that remained unrepresented in some way during the revolution. This social diversity and at the same time unity is one of the particular features of the revolution. Despite the degree of diversity, it's the social unity that we can see centered on the fundamental demands of the revolution, which is to say freedom and independence, that make up the heart of 1956. Though the historical literature identifies several different groupings within the social groups taking part in the revolution, as well as several different ideological streams, the main thing is precisely that no matter how we define these categories, everyone fought together for the same goal, each strengthening the other. The 2 weeks or so of the revolution saw an armed struggle for liberation in Budapest, supported by the entire country, aimed at regaining the country's independence. The lion's share of the fighting was done by the young, something illustrated very clearly by the fact that almost half of those killed during the fighting belonged to this category. It's worth noting the national unity and social support that grew day by day for those fighting in the revolution. And though the epicenter of the fighting was clearly the capital, the spirit of the revolution extended to the entire country. The phenomenon of the Hungarian fight for freedom presented a new challenge, a situation for which there was no pre-existing playbook. For though there had been popular risings in the region in Berlin in 1953 and Poznan in the summer of 1956, these were primarily focused on economic demands. In contrast, the Hungarian Revolution was an out-and-out struggle for independence from Soviet rule, and it was not about attaining economic goals either at the start or later on. At the same time, the Soviet leadership could not allow a country that belonged to its intimate sphere of influence to slip out of its control, potentially giving rise to a chain reaction in the region. The crushing of the revolution was tacitly accepted by the Western powers as an unavoidable evil, in accordance with the realities of the geopolitical situation at the time, in a world divided between two opposing camps. On 4th November 1956, Soviet troops began the rolling up of the revolution in a crushing superiority of numbers. Meanwhile, a loyal communist government was formed under the leadership of János Kádár. Thanks to this relative victory, Moscow was able to keep its empire intact, preserve its place in the Cold War world order, and keep its position as a superpower unquestioned for a little while longer. But it was never managed to escape the moral damage it suffered as a result. 1956 was an event on the world stage, and its impact was also global. The Soviet Empire, which had seemed unassailable till then, wavered for a moment, while the brutal crushing of a fight for liberty drew aside the veil on the true nature of the communist regime for the intelligentsia of the West as well. It was the end of the age of illusions. The world looked differently at Hungary after 1956, and Hungary looked differently at the world. Thanks to the revolution, the mostly negative picture of Hungarians formed thanks to their part in the Second World War changed. To this was added a sense of guilt in the Western nations over their inaction, which gave rise to positive attitudes towards and a significant willingness to help refugees from Hungary. The diaspora they formed had an especially important role, both in keeping those who stayed behind informed and in keeping the memory of 1956 alive. Paradoxically, one of the greatest beneficiaries of this positive attitude on the international stage came with time to be the very same Kádár regime that had crushed the revolution. Meanwhile, the Hungarians, the Western aid that the revolutionaries so earnestly hoped for not being forthcoming, learned their lesson. They could count only on themselves. The disillusionment occasioned by 1956 put an end to all hope and waiting on miracles. It became obvious to all that it was not in the interests of the Western powers to change the post-war status quo. The acknowledgement of this contributed heavily to the acceptance of the realpolitik of the Kádár period and the peaceful nature of the transition to democracy in 1989-1990. 1956 represented such a break that nothing could afterwards be the same. This is perhaps the best illustration of the fact that though it was put down, the revolution was not in vain. It was obvious that things could not go on as they had before. Both Hungarian society and those in power had to draw the relevant consequences. The experience of 1956 defined the relationship of the Kádár regime to the whole Hungarian society. Following the brutal repression aimed at warning people against any further action and reinforcing the new Kádár-led regime's position, the memory of '56 acted as a brake throughout the period, encouraging the country's leaders to a certain self-restraint. The regime was willing to go to great lengths to avoid the repetition of this kind of uprising. This sort of phobia of '56, or rather the fear of repeated open conflict, was the cornerstone of the policies of the Kádár regime. It was from here that the specific characteristics of so-called Kádárism were derived, being an almost permanent reflection on 1956. On the other side, society was able to set aside for itself that pride and moral strength that the 2 weeks in which the people had taken their destiny in their own hands had given them. The intervention on November 4th had made it abundantly clear where the power lay. In its aftermath, there were legal proceedings against 24,000 people, 229 of whom were executed for their part in the revolution. The brutality of the reprisals and the regime's pragmatic policies for increasing the standard of living led to a tacit agreement that for a while put to bed lingering memories. This bargain was based on mutual fear. The crux of this was that Kadar was afraid of a repetition of 56, while the country was afraid of the Soviet army and further reprisals. The regime did not put the Hungarian people's patience to the test again thanks to 56, and the people temporarily renounced their quest for any sort of say in how the country was run. The main reference point for the Kadar regime, understandably, having been born in sin when the revolution was put down, was, throughout its tenure, the revolution. Since the regime derived its legitimacy from the denial of the revolution, any expression of opinion about 56 meant taking a stand against the Kadar regime as a whole, both in terms of its nature and its right to exist. 1956 was the alpha and the omega of the entire regime, so how the event was viewed and discussed by people was far from unimportant for the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. The narrative that would last right into the 1980s was essentially fully formed by December of 1956 and determined official discourse on the revolution. According to this discourse, what had happened was in fact a counter-revolution, the ultimate goal of which was a restoration of the pre-war order. This was the formula that was included in history books as well as official statements. The vast majority of society had experienced 1956 as a revolution even at the time, and this experience was reinforced when the regime that had put it down branded it a counter-revolution. This view of the revolution survived rigidly for as long as the material circumstances necessary for the existence of the Kadar regime subsisted. The psychological effect of the reprisals, Cold War confrontation, and its partial legitimation thanks to its policies for increasing the standard of living. When these pillars of the regime started to wobble, the problem of legitimation, and 1956 along with it, once more popped up on the regime's horizon. Since the problem of 1956 was a Gordian knot for the regime, they tried over time to envelop it in a silence insofar as possible. This is how it came to be nationally repressed and the victim of growing historical amnesia. The regime was thus silent about 56 and expected people to stay silent too. This became the state's primary strategy because they could not hope for any consensus within Hungarian society when it came to 1956. But it was clear to the regime as well that though Hungarian society was silent, it was not because they had forgotten the revolution and its heroes. People who had been adults at the time of the revolution had their direct experiences of the events, and these did not, of course, accord with the official version. The fundamental demands of the revolution, including the desire for national independence, the resentment of the Soviet occupation, and the distaste for the dictatorship, remained just as vibrant in the thinking of the average person. As a result, the enforced official memory was in sharp contrast with family memories, which drew on personal experience. Thus, while the approach to the 1956 from the top down was primarily characterized by the creation of a taboo around it, if we look at it from the micro level, 56 was a personal experience, and the processing of these experiences was also a personal affair, not a public. Which is to say that the only place that the real heritage of 56 could be handed on was within the family in oral form. Needless to say, different families employed different models. There were some where the memory was always present, being passed down from generation to generation and becoming part of family legend, while, of course, having to stay out of the public political field. Meanwhile, in other families, the politics of taboo did have some effect on the parents and grandparents. This has had long-term consequences that can still be felt today, as subsequent generations were unable to gain any real knowledge of the events. The systemic crisis of the 1980s upset the existing invisible social contract between society and the regime. From then on, the situation changed. In line with the opening up of the regime, it became possible to bring back to life the memory of 1956 within Hungarian society and to confront the Kádár regime as well. 1956 became a factor in development of identity. It's no coincidence that the most important symbols and moments of the transition to democracy were connected to the revolution of 1956. The party, becoming aware of the economic and later social crisis, attempted the impossible to try and do something with 1956, the repression that followed, and its own genesis. Though the project was doomed to failure from the start, this discussion of the past led the genie out of the bottle. In order to ensure the control, which had already slipped, should not get further out of the party's hands, a historical subcommittee was established, which declared that 1956 was a popular uprising. It was not so much the label that was important for wider society. For the question of whether what had happened in Hungary had been a revolution, a counter-revolution, or popular uprising was not an issue for wider Hungarian society, as the majority was well aware of what had happened. It was the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party that had any internal debates about it. The real significance of the statement that was issued about this lay partly in the fact that it elevated the question to the very forefront of public attention, since it came from within the highest circles of the party. It also overturned the interpretation that had been in force for some 30 years, and thus shook the very basis of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party's self-legitimation, something the party could not put right either then or later. The especially significant role played by the revolution at this time also derived from the fact that the memory of 1956 was a positive political tradition of which every opposition force could make use. The memory of 1956 brought them together in their fight against the regime. It was completely understandable that this unity and agreement fell apart after the end of the one-party system. As the desire for liberty had overshadowed all differences in 1956, the tradition of 1956 united all the opposition forces in 1989. As similar as the goals of the two historical events may have been, the methods could not have been more different, since both the old and the new political actors wanted to avoid armed conflict. Thus, the representatives of the ruling party and the opposition both sought a peaceful solution, which was one of the most significant accomplishments of the process of transition in Hungary. One of the main symbols of confronting the past at the time of the transition to democracy was the figure of the revolution's prime minister, Imre Nagy. Despite the communist politician's complex life, his life story became one with the matter of the revolution and became the face of the contradictions within the Kádár regime. After the crushing of the revolution, Imre Nagy was for Kádár the living reminder of his own about turn in early November. Precisely for this reason, he resolved the problem in the most radical manner possible by executing Nagy and his fellows. But as a result, he made a martyr of his former political colleague and was left to struggle with the moral implications of his decision for the rest of his life. The fall of the communist regime on the 16th June 1989 became obvious to everyone at the reburial of Imre Nagy and his fellow martyrs, who had been executed in 1958 and then cremated under false names in less than dignified circumstances. The 16th June 1989 proved both a historical and psychological turning point in the process of democratic transition. Together with Imre Nagy, the Hungarian people buried the Kádár regime as well. The funeral represented an acceptance of the heritage of '56, something all opposition forces agreed on at the time. The crowd of some 200,000 people that came to the reburial of Imre Nagy at the same time delegitimized the regime and legitimized the forces working towards political change. Thanks to the live TV coverage of the whole day, public opinion throughout the country was confronted at the same time with the buried truth, something that had a cathartic effect. The fact that János Kádár died a month later on the very same day that the highest court ordered the rehabilitation of Imre Nagy and his companions was merely a coincidental twist of fate. The new Hungarian Republic was declared on the 33rd anniversary of the revolution, the 23rd October 1989. The freely elected parliament then passed the law in 1990, enshrining the memory of the revolution and struggle for freedom. During the 26 years that have passed since the transition to democracy, unfettered discussion of 56 has become possible. Needless to say, a multitude of opinions and often arguments have come to the surface. The remembrance of 56 has become in many cases divisive, often motivated by today's politics, and this is something we should not be surprised about. For society only began to talk about and process the events of 56 with a delay of 30 years. It's also hard to see the events of 56 clearly because the historical place of 1956 has become a question of primary concern both politically and in terms of legitimation. Though the Marxist interpretation of the revolution did not last very long, the fact that the subject had been taboo under communism was not without its effects. On the one hand, the debates and dilemmas that we have come up show that it will take time before some kind of common consensus is reached on the subject of 56 that will locate it within our collective historical memory. On the other, the years of silence and official state propaganda alienated people from 1956. The result of the high-quality historical research carried out in the past 2 decades or so have only reached a small circle of people. Now, in 2016, with the 60th anniversary, we have a chance both to reflect on and remember the events that took place and to bring the message of the revolution closer to society. Thank you very much for your attention.